I mean, I see my picture here along with Adyashanti and Rupert Spira and Pamela Wilson and Gangaji and all these people, and I feel like I hope you have no illusions that I'm some kind of a spiritual teacher or luminary or anything like that. I don't purport to be. But I do feel like I have a role that I'm well suited for and have spent most of my life preparing for, not knowing that I was preparing for it, but I somehow stumbled into it, and it has been very fulfilling for me, and it seems to be beneficial for a lot of people. I was just down at the Science and Nonduality conference, and I couldn't walk 10 steps without somebody coming up to me and saying, your show has had such an effect on my life. I mean, all kinds of stories. One person said this thing was happening to me. I had no idea what it was, and I did some searches on the internet, and I began to find out about this awakening thing, Enlightenment thing, and then I started checking out different teachers, and so it all began to make sense to me, and I realized I wasn't going crazy and things like that. And other people, that, well, you connected me with my teacher. I never would have known about so-and-so. And so I really... It's very gratifying to have that sort of effect. I used to be a student of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he once told me that I was a connector and a collector. So I feel like I'm kind of doing that in a way. And it's funny because at the same time I feel like I'm not doing it. And I know that sounds like a spiritual cliche, but once in a while I'll be looking at the website or something at all these hundreds of names of people that I've interviewed, and I think, how in the heck is this happening? I don't even feel like I'm doing anything. I'm just kind of going along from day to day, and this thing is happening somehow out of it, and it's having all these ripples of effect all over the world. So I really do kind of feel like an instrument or a tool of the divine, and it's very gratifying to do that, to be that. As I said, I just came from the Science and Non-Duality conference, and I always go to that conference. I'm interested in the interface of science and spirituality. I'm not a scientist, but I'd like to talk about some thoughts that I play with all the time and have played with over the years and continue to refine as I think about them and talk about them with people. The theme of the Science and Non-Duality Conference this year was on the edge of the unknown. And so I thought about that, and I thought, will the unknown always have an edge? Or will we somehow reach an end point in which we actually do know everything? There are actually scientists who feel that at a certain point, science is going to have it all figured out. And most people who feel that way already feel that spirituality and mysticism and all that has been rendered obsolete by science. And that the tools of objective science are going to answer all the questions. Now, I don't think most scientists feel that way, but there are some. I think even Stephen Hawking and, what was his name, Leonard Mlodinow or something like that, wrote a book along those lines, and sort of announcing that science had finally already displaced all the religious myths of creation, and we didn't need those anymore. So there's a certain... Science is notorious for having a certain arrogance, about how advanced we are and how much we know. And yet look at what's happening to the world. We've gained a lot of technological knowledge, and there's a very real possibility that human beings won't exist in a couple hundred years if things go the way they seem to be going. So obviously we don't know everything. There must be something more we could know that could allow our technologies to be more benign and allow them to benefit us without destroying us. And I think that's where spirituality comes in. Science without spirituality, it's sort of like, little knowledge is a dangerous thing. There isn't necessarily any kind of moral or ethical compass for technology. very powerful technologies can end up in the hands of people who are very greedy or small-minded, and who really don't care about the consequences of what they're doing, who are basically looking at the bottom line of the next quarter and aren't thinking about the next generation or 7 generations or anything like that. So, and who regard nature in a very mechanistic way. The earth is an object and it's here for us to exploit. And one way of thinking about that is that scientific and technological advancements utilize certain laws of nature. We discover a law or a principle, even the way a jet plane flies. I mean, people studied birds for a long time trying to figure out how they did it. And you've seen those old films of early airplanes where they had things that flapped up and down and bounced all over the place and didn't get anywhere. But they eventually figured out the principle of the differentiation of the air pressure over a wing if the wing is shaped in a certain way, and how that created lift. And so they understood something about some law of nature, and that provided a valuable technology. But there are innumerable laws of nature, and very often technologies harness or meddle with certain laws of nature without really knowing the ramifications of that, without really knowing the implications of what we might do if we tinker with this or tinker with that. And often there are disastrous consequences. I mean, genetic engineering is a potentially disastrous thing, where we're monkeying around at the level of the genome, and we don't really know exactly what effect we're going to have. And again, there's the financial incentive to do this thing, and a lot of money has been invested in research, and so they want to get the product out there to recoup their investment. But it's dangerous because we don't harness the intelligence of nature. Rather, we're meddling with it. And I would suggest there's a verse from Rig Veda which goes, Richo akshare parame vyoman yasmin deva adivishve nishedu, and it goes on a bit more. But what it says basically is that all the impulses of intelligence which give rise to and govern the manifest universe. In other words, we could say laws of nature, because I think the laws of nature are not just mechanistic and dumb, they're actually impulses of intelligence, governed by intelligence. All those laws of nature reside, says this verse, in the transcendental akasha, in the transcendental field. And then it goes on to say that if you don't know that field, then what can those impulses of intelligence do for you? What can those laws do for you? But if you do know that field, then you come into alignment with natural law, with all the laws of nature, and you function in such a way as to not create harm unwittingly by doing a specific thing and then unknowingly violating other things. I think people who are deeply attuned to the transcendent, to their true nature, have found that in their personal lives this is very often the case, that you move much more gently and sensitively in the world, much more wisely. You don't blunder about, creating problems for yourselves and for yourself and others. And we can envision the potential of the possibility of a society in which everyone was functioning that way. And I think that if we had such a society, we wouldn't have so many problems by a long shot. I would posit that every problem that besets us as a society is the reflection of the collective consciousness of all the individuals in the world. And if most of the individuals in the world have sort of incoherent, very partial grasp of the totality, then their collective influence is going to be, to some extent positive, to some extent negative. And you can kind of gauge by the degree of harmful or positive technologies and situations with the environment and all that, how the collective consciousness fares at the moment. It could definitely use some upliftment. You may have heard that just in the last week or two, it was announced that through the use of the Hubble telescope, it has been determined that there are about 10 times more galaxies in the known universe than we realized. It used to be hundreds of billions, now it's about 2 trillion or something. And that's just the known universe. And according to both physicists and some ancient cosmologies, there may be innumerable universes. But let's just stick with one. If there are 2 trillion galaxies in the known universe, and if there is a spiritually or technologically or both advanced civilization in each of those universes, only one, that would be 2 trillion such civilizations. But we know from the Kepler telescope that, at least in our neighborhood, most stars have planets around them, it seems. And my hunch is that the universe is teeming with life of all sorts, and that there are uncountable civilizations that are far more advanced than ours, both technologically and spiritually. So I think that's just a good thought to ponder, because there tends to be a bit of hubris both in scientific and spiritual circles about how much we know and how advanced we are and so on. I think it's kind of good to stay humble. And some of the teachers, the spiritual teachers I respect most, talk that way themselves, like Adyashanti, for instance. He says, I'm always a beginner. I just had a nice interview with him yesterday that I'll be posting pretty soon, and he was saying, couple hundred years from now, they might look, and if they remember me at all, they might say, boy, that guy was a real, duffer, and he hardly knew anything. And it might be that the average man on the street is as wise as the type of people we now consider to be spiritual luminaries, so to speak. All right, that was a little bit of an aside, but I just wanted to throw that out there. I'd like to speak for a minute about how science and spirituality might help each other. I spoke a bit about how spirituality might help science. If spirituality, in fact, is capable of attuning people more deeply to the nature's intelligence, if it's capable of enlivening moral or ethical values in people, making them more sensitive, more caring, more loving, things like that, then I think that could, make these powerful tools that technology has given us, it would put them in safer hands. But let's do it the other way around. How can science help spirituality? I think it's really important that when I use the word spirituality, I'm not implying faith or belief or anything of that nature. I'm talking about experience. And I think most of you probably have that orientation shown, given the teachers I see on this flyer here. We're not satisfied with being told that something is such and such, and then just spending our lives believing that and hoping that will do us any good. We may not have thought of it this way, but most of us probably regard the so-called faith statements of spiritual traditions as working hypotheses that we might test. If the Upanishads say something about the ultimate nature of reality, or some Buddhist scriptures or Christian scriptures or something else, we want to experience that. I don't think that Jesus or Buddha or any of those great teachers really cared what we believed, even though they're often translated as saying that. They cared what we experienced. They wanted us to experience what they were experiencing, and they did their best to say things that would align people with and provide practices and teachings and so on that would enable people to do that. And those practices tended, many of them I think, tended to have a scientific nature to them. A teacher would say, well, there's this, that, and the other. He might say, for instance, there's a transcendental field and it's deep within you and you could access it. Now here's a technique. Check it out, try it, see if it works, see if you do find that. And then the students might say, yeah, well, I had this experience. And then the teacher might say something to clarify their experience. So the point here is that it's really healthy to observe and to question and hypothesize and experiment and analyze and before reaching conclusions. Those are the basic steps of science. And spirituality, if we include religion in the word spirituality, has really not had that kind of attitude for most of its, historical existence. I mean, hundreds of millions of people have been killed and tortured in the name of what really actually represents the most sublime experience a human being can have. But it's been so distorted and misunderstood and so entrenched in dogma and rigidity that people have been killing each other over these things. I think that the founders of most religions would be rolling in their graves if they saw what ended up happening to their teachings. I think understanding is really important on the spiritual path, and for a couple of different reasons. One is that it's a motivator. It's inspiring. If we actually understood what the possibilities were, we'd be very excited about realizing those possibilities. When you drive around the city here, you see a lot of people walking around for whom life seems very difficult, rather bleak. And when you look at the news, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who are having a really tough time of it, who probably think that life is meaningless, it's a struggle, it's suffering, it's, life sucks, then you die, is the saying. And I think it's a shame, because I think that in a sense, we're all like multimillionaires who've forgotten that we have a bank account with all that wealth in it, and we're just sort of pinching pennies and begging on street corners trying to get by. But if we had access to our bank account, so to speak, well, even if somebody came and told us about the bank account, most wouldn't believe it. They'd say, well, I don't know, my life's really tough, and this bank account seems rather, far-fetched and far away. But if a means could be provided to people to enable them to access the tremendous wealth of energy, intelligence, creativity, happiness, Satchitananda that lie within them, then they could begin to bring that forth, and sure enough, their lives would improve. So somehow or other, I hope that the knowledge, and it's happening, that the knowledge that there's more to life than meets the eye and is proliferating, and more people are, becoming inspired to discover it and to wake up. That's definitely happening. So that's one reason. It's a motivator. The Upanishads state that all happiness that we derive from any external experience is actually just a reflection of inner happiness, just as the light of the moon is a reflection of the light of the sun. So you could, in a sense, if that's true, you could say that everybody's chasing enlightenment, whether they're going after the new car or the new job or the new relationship or whatever they're looking for. They're looking for happiness. They're looking for fulfillment. And according to the Upanishads and many other scriptures, ultimately fulfillment is found in sort of oceanic amounts at the very core of our existence, the very core of our being. Now, that is not to say that we should just ignore or lose interest in external pursuits, but if that inner happiness can be really discovered and experienced and stabilized in our awareness, then it can be tremendously enriching to all of our outer experiences. Whatever you're doing can be so much more enjoyable. I mean, think of a relationship, for instance. Relationships can be very difficult and can sort of lose their luster, and there can be all sorts of problems, and people are sort of full of stress and pent-up frustrations and so on that kind of ruin the potential enjoyment of the relationship. But if that stuff could be worked out, if people could realize experientially that they're actually one with one another at the most fundamental level, then a deep level of harmony could characterize the relationship that is kind of rare in most relationships. So that's just one example. There are many more. Another reason I think knowledge of the path or knowledge of the spiritual landscape is important and I'll elaborate a bit more on what I mean by knowledge in a bit, is that so many weird things have come down in the name of spirituality, you know? I mean, both throughout history and contemporarily. There have been so many cults and strange situations that people have gotten involved in which they've wasted money and time and, you know, suffered all kinds of heartbreaks and difficulties. And, you know, so many spiritual teachers have appeared to be very inspiring and worthy of our attention, and then have crashed and burned in one way or another, and disillusioned a lot of people, perhaps hurt a lot of people in the process. So I think if we as individuals and we as a larger spiritual community had a clearer understanding of what awakening really looks like, so to speak, we, as the Who said, we won't get fooled again. You know, there will be a greater sort of discernment in choosing a teacher, choosing a path, not staying with someone who's abusive or trying to take all your money or trying to take you to bed or whatever else these teachers have tried to do, and many of whom have given spirituality a bad name in a way. So it safeguards the path.
What is it that you mean when you say awakening and spirituality? I came in a little late. Maybe I didn't.
Good question. My understanding is, and that's a very good question, because I hear so many people say, "Well, I had my awakening, and you know, or I woke in 19 whatever," and I often wonder what they're talking about. Or they say, "Are you awake?" You know, and different traditions approach this differently. I've heard, you know, Zen monks say, "Well, I've had many awakenings, some minor, some major. Some seem to see it as a watershed moment, you know, that you cross, and it's like breaking the sound barrier or something. And once you're on the other side, it's completely different. And that may be many people's experience. Others that it's a progressive thing, that there are stages and stages and stages and stages, and maybe both are true." But my sense of it is that there is, I mean, we can draw the line and define the term however we want, but the way I would customarily use it is that, you know, we do have a sort of a true nature, we could say, pure awareness. We usually, it's not we have it, it gets tricky to talk about it, but most people regard themselves as being their body and the things they're interested in and their politics. If you ask them who they are, they begin to tell you what they like and where they work and that kind of stuff. And that's really not what we actually are. We're something much more fundamental than that. And the various scriptures and traditions describe it as being unbounded pure awareness that's not limited to any individual body, much like the ocean, whereas individual bodies might be more like the wave. And most people feel like, I am this wave, and I'm separate from that wave and all the other waves. And I'm vulnerable because the wind could blow me over and I could cease to exist or something, or I could crash up against the rocks and be gone. But what the traditions tell us is that, yeah, you're a wave, but more significantly and more fundamentally, you're the ocean which gives rise to all waves. And therefore, thereby, you are indestructible, eternal, and never-ending. There's a verse from the Bhagavad Gita which says, "The unreal has no being, the real never ceases to be." So, spirituality of the type I'm talking about, or awakening, as I use the word, is with reference to awareness waking up to itself as that unbounded, fundamental, pure consciousness.
Having talked to younger postdoc age scientists, I don't know if it's because they were raised by baby boomers, but that divide, that hard, as if there is a line, doesn't, they don't seem to be the old-fashioned scientists, I notice. They have a wider or a deeper or a different perspective, I've noticed.
Which is what?
That you can expand your perspective to encompass your experience, your consciousness, and
Great.
That there's not such the duality. That,
Yeah.
So the scientists you speak about, I don't know, maybe it's generational or maybe
it could be.
I mean, you'll see with such heavy contrasts now in the politics, there's a cultural thing, like he's woke, she's woke, meaning there's a certain consciousness, that's awakening where younger people and different cultures are using that term, meaning this awareness.
Yeah.
And I just find that sometimes the scientist label isn't what it used to. It doesn't define people that it used to.
Yeah, so there's a couple good points there. One is that it's not fair to paint all scientists with the same brush, and that it could be that there's sort of there might be a generational thing where the older folks are a little bit more stuck in their ways and younger people are more open-minded. It usually works that way. Someone, I forget who, said that science progresses by a series of funerals. Because people get so, they're entrenched, they're stuck to their paradigms, and they're resistant to change, and so they die off and new paradigms come into vogue.
And it might even be the feminine.
That too, very important. Yeah, absolutely. But another point that your question triggers in me is this sort of like, oh, he's awake, or she woke up, or something like that. I don't know. I get a little uncomfortable when people say that because I just don't know exactly what they're referring to. And that leads into a whole section of my talk that I'd like to, it relates to this thing about knowledge. I think that it would be really valuable, well, if we, when Lewis and Clark explored North America, they had a real fuzzy idea of what was out there. They didn't know what they were getting into and how big it was, or where certain that there even were certain mountain ranges and things like that, and they had all sorts of difficulties because of that lack of knowledge. These days, of course, with satellite technology and everything else, we have the whole continent, the whole world mapped out to the centimeter, probably, and GPS gets us exactly where we want to go. I think that using the map metaphor, it would be really valuable, and I think this will be a project of hundreds of years, if not thousands, to have a clear map of the spiritual territory, the full range of potential spiritual experience. And it's almost silly to refer to it as spiritual experience, because we're really talking about understanding the nature of reality in its depth. I mean, let me back up a second. When you say spiritual experience, to many people's minds, that denotes a kind of a subjective thing. You have this inner bliss, or you have this vision, or something else, and there's no indication that what you're experiencing has any objective reality. It's kind of like if we were all sleeping and we were hooked up to the appropriate apparatus, scientists could tell, if they were in the next room reading the meters, that we were dreaming when we dreamt. They could tell, okay, now that person is dreaming. But they couldn't tell what we were dreaming. And we could wake up and describe our dreams to them. But most of those dreams, unless we give some credence to the notion of, shamanistic visions or some kind of cognition or something that might sometimes happen in the dream state, most of those dreams are probably just sort of mental fabrications that don't have any counterpart in the quote-unquote real world. But I feel that that the spiritual quest is not something to merely indulge in subjective experiences that may be gratifying, but it's actually an exploration of the full nature of reality. And the full nature of reality would include not only pure consciousness, which we were talking about a minute ago, the ocean, but if we want to keep with the ocean metaphor, it would include the full depth of the ocean and all the fish that might live there at different levels. So in other words, there is not only this sort of absolute foundation to things, which physicists might call the unified field, but there are many strata of creation, subtle to gross or gross to subtle. And many spiritual traditions have talked about these things. You can read books like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or, Jesus said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And I'm sure you could find references to this sort of thing in every tradition. I feel that it would be really valuable, for starters, it would be a real interesting PhD thesis for someone to do, to take all the traditional maps and try to match them up and see where there's agreement, and try to find out if they're to take the ancient wisdom and see to what extent it can give us a sense of the full range of reality that spirituality is capable of exploring. But I think that won't be the end of it. I think in a way that'll just be the start. And different, that is not to say that everybody's going to become kind of uniform in their experience. We're all, or that they should. I think we're all wired differently, and different people are going to have different cognitions and different experiences. Even in the ancient Vedic rishis, different ones would cognize different hymns of the Veda. They weren't wired to cognize them all. This particular lineage would cognize this one, and this particular lineage would cognize that one. And it's kind of like if you take the map metaphor again. There are many maps of North America. There are weather maps. There are, topographical maps. There are maps for aviation. There are maps of oil deposits. And there are road maps, obviously, maps of railroads. All these different things are of the same territory. They all refer to the same territory, but they have sort of different purposes and different uses for different people, for different needs. So I think that a really well mapped out, a really mature map of the spiritual realm, which even that word is just too simple, but of the full nature of reality that human beings are capable of experiencing, would have different variations. Some might. And people would gravitate toward different aspects of it, while still in agreement with and comfortable with the fact that others' experiences, although different than theirs, were equally valid. That this person is qualified to experience in this way, this person leans more toward that, but we're all getting pieces, we're all feeling the same elephant, that metaphor. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit. So any feedback on what I've said just now from anybody? Anand? Yeah.
Well, it just strikes me. Go ahead.
Oh, yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to, we talk about Jesus and Buddha like they actually existed. I think the only one that's really kind of taken that on is Jack Kornfield. And when he gives
what did he say?
Well, when he gives a talk on, this is on the radio, not even a Dharma talk, he was talking about the Buddha myth of the mustard seed, the Buddha myth of this, the Buddha myth of that.
That he didn't really exist?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe Tim Freak talks about has a Jesus myth book with Peter Gandy that Jesus didn't actually exist. That it's just a sort of a recurring mythology that comes up in different cultures and so on.
Exactly, and also they went to the we don't want to get too hung up on this. In the Caesar's Christ, they went in and
the what?
Caesar's Christ as a book.
Caesar's Christ.
Yeah, and they decided, the Caesars were the actual ones that created the Jesus myth because, it's very expensive to go all the way to Israel with all these troops and everything. So, if someone hits you, turn the other cheek, and if you walk a mile with a Roman asks you to walk a mile with his bag, walk another one, and all. Yeah. It's all, the whole thing. Anyway, I don't want to get hung up on that.
Well,
But,
I would say that even if it's true, and I'm no scholar of such things, even if it's true that some of these great historical figures were either, totally fabricated or at least embellished, the things they did,
Right.
there could have been a lot of exaggeration over time.
Right.
We don't need to resort to ancient records to feel comfortable that spiritual enlightenment is a possibility, because there are contemporary examples,
Yeah.
in both recent and current times.
Yeah. Well, if you say that, gee, I realize I'm not doing this. I've heard this from a lot of people, and so hopefully they're, But anyway, this is more of a concept than anything. But there was this guy that died about 2 weeks ago where we live, and just before he died, he tried to kiss this woman and got in all kinds of trouble. The police were involved and this and that. And then that was like Tuesday and Wednesday. He got into a political argument, wanted to fight the guy, chose him out. And the guy, backed down and said, "No, you're my friend. I don't want to fight." And then on the next day, he was walking to a restaurant. And
You're not talking about Donald Trump, are you?
No.
Okay.
No.
Kissing
The next
a
day,
woman
he died.
Yeah.
He leaned up against the telephone pole and fell down.
Uh-huh.
And my question was, I guess it's probably maybe half concept and not half it. Anyway, so Source was doing all those things?
Okay, that's a good question. I can do something with that. There are people who say that, there's no free will, and everything is just genetics and conditioning. Ramesh Balsekar said that over and over, if you've heard of him. I think that, like many things, truth is sort of multi-layered, and there are different levels of reality which are true in their own right, but paradoxically opposed to one another. Let me just give you an example. So I get this model. Timothy Conway expresses this very clearly. He has written a nice article on it on his site, enlightenedspirituality.org. But he has what he calls the threefold threefold paradoxically true levels of reality or something. The first one would be the gross, obvious level of the world that we're all familiar with, where there are problems and difficulties and this and that, and we need to deal with those things on their own level. If there's pollution, we need to clean it up or stop contributing to it or whatever. You can't just ignore it. A second level would be the divine level, where everything is God, everything is divinely orchestrated, everything is absolutely perfect just as it is, including the pollution. There's no mistakes in the universe. It's all just running like clockwork. A deeper level would be the unmanifest level, where nothing ever happened. There is no universe. Nothing ever arose. You've probably heard statements like that from Ramana Maharshi and others. Each of those is true, actually. It's just that knowledge is different at different levels of consciousness, different states of experience. And people tend to get stuck in one or the other of those levels. There might be people who are stuck on the level of, we got to really do something about all the problems in the world, and all this other stuff about, everything's perfect and there is no universe. It's just a lot of nonsense. It's not practical. It's not going to help us. There are people who, I've heard people, there was an interchange at the Science and Nonduality Conference 4 or 5 years ago where David Loy, who was a Buddhist teacher, got up and was challenging a speaker to say, what about environmental problems? And we need to do something. We need to, apply our spirituality in a practical way. And he was just saying, whatever happens, it's all perfect just as it is. We don't need to do anything. And the world is a speck of dust if it disappears, whatever. And then, I've also heard people talk that, nothing ever happened. There is no universe. There is no person. There is no self. Each of those is true on its own level, but if you get stuck in one or the other of those levels, it's lopsided. It doesn't do justice to the full range of possibilities. And I think that a mature spirituality is an embodiment of the full range of creation in living in a living life. The word Brahman, which you may have heard, actually is defined as the inclusion of they talk of three levels: Adi Bhuta, Adi Daiva, and Adi Atma. That's the three levels I just described, and it includes all the full range of the relative and the absolute, all wrapped up in one big package, and that's the totality. That's the reality, not just this slice or this slice or this slice.
That sounds wow. Just one last question. I went to this talk the other day, and he ended it with, "There is no separate self," and that was sort of like a zinger.
He was saying that in the talk? Somebody?
Yeah. At the very end of the talk. And I thought, gee, no separate self, and then, if they put something over my nose and mouth, I probably wouldn't be around for 3 minutes.
You'd be struggling. You'd see.
I'd be struggling, and the rain could have fallen, 3 months ago, and I'm drinking it now, and that's in my blood. So I sort of get that a little bit. I don't know if it's a concept or not, but...
Well, to my level, to my understanding, my friend Francis Bennett has a nice phrase that he likes to repeat a lot, and I think it even has it on the homepage of his website. He says, "Of course you're a person. You're just not only a person." So, on some level, there's no separate self. Very true. Put your hand on a stove, and very quickly there's this felt sense that there's a separate self. At least most of us would feel that way. And that separate self doesn't like the pain that it's experiencing and wants to do something about it. And now some people have the experience, if they're deeply grounded in the capital S self, in true nature, that they experience the pain, and yet they don't experience it at the same time. There's a dimension in their experience which is beyond the reach of pain. I was a student of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi for a long time, and he was once doing an interview with on the BBC with an interviewer named Malcolm Muggeridge, and Maharishi and the abbot of Downside were in this discussion with Malcolm Muggeridge, and Maharishi liked to shake people up. So he said at some point during this interview, "Christ never suffered." And of course both Muggeridge and the abbot of Downside got a little unnerved by that statement. But he went on to explain that, he appeared to be suffering, and obviously his body was going through something rather nasty, and there must have been pain and so on. But if he was really Christ, if he was really what he was cracked up to be, then the predominant subjective experience, he must have been so well established in being that he was untouched. That's the world in which he dwelt primarily. There's a phrase in Vedanta which is called Lesha Vidya, which means faint remains of ignorance, and it's said that there needs to be some Lesha Vidya, some faint remains of ignorance, in order to function as a human being, and that if not for that, you think of Ramana Maharshi in the cave, or in the pit beneath the temple, where he was being chewed by insects and so on, and would have died if someone hadn't dragged him out of there and cleaned him up. Maybe he was at a stage at that point where he was just so beyond the world that he was oblivious to his body. But he came out of there, and he spent years in a cave meditating and whatnot, and eventually came out and started speaking and teaching. And yet, when he was close to death, and he was suffering from cancer and actually screaming in pain at times, people would ask him about what he was experiencing, and he made it very clear that although it appeared that he was suffering, he was really untouched by it. And they said, please don't die, please don't leave us. Where could I go? So there's this kind of, you got to take any statement that somebody says like that and bring it back to this multidimensional kind of perspective, where it's not just this or that, it's both and the whole gamut. And don't take your stand. Here's a quote from the Bible. Jesus said, "For the birds have their nests and the foxes have their holes, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." And to me that means you don't take a fixed stance. There's no place to land. There's just sort of this openness, and in a way, lack of certainty, which is much more secure than taking a fixed stand and saying it's this way, because it's never just this way. There's always the paradox and the ambiguity. And if you try to take a fixed stand, you're always on shaky ground, because it can always be challenged or usurped or disrupted. So just to reiterate, I think spiritual evolution is a process of more and more inclusion, more and more expansion of the circumference of our awareness, of our experience, to include all the sort of diverse and paradoxical realities of existence within a totality that's capable of harmonizing them all. And I really don't think there's any end to it. I was speaking to a friend and a spiritual teacher down at the SAND conference. It's the first time we'd met in person. We'd been in touch for years. I interviewed him years ago, and we've been exchanging political emails and other things ever since. And I mentioned this idea of there possibly not being any end to spiritual evolution, and it just goes on and on. He said, "Well, I feel like I'm finished. I'm done. I'm complete." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Well, if we went back to the way you were experiencing things 10 years ago, if you could remember that." Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not close enough. If we went back to the way you were experiencing things 10 years ago, if you could remember that, and you can contrast that with the way you're experiencing things right now, would there be any difference whatsoever? And he said, "Well, yeah, but you're talking about the manifest. I'm talking about the my true nature, the absolute value." And I said, "Well, of course, that doesn't change. We'd be in big trouble if it did. But the degree to which pure true nature can be integrated into our relative life, to my mind, has no end. And there's no. Think of the various faculties we have as human beings. We have, senses. We have an intellect. We have a heart." There have been some very brilliant intellects in this world. There have been some very huge hearts, incredibly compassionate people. There have been people with very, very refined senses and perceptual capabilities. So there's the potential to refine all of our faculties more and more and more. And I see that as kind of if we feel we've landed in the self and that it's never going to change, then there's a kind of a coming back and an infusion of that into our relative life. I was having a discussion about this topic again just the other day, and someone was saying, it might have been Adya, was saying that you can, there have been people who've sort of woken up to their true nature, but have been real jerks, really very poor in relating to people, or dishonest in business relationships, or things like that. And obviously there's some room for improvement. There's some room for enhancement. A friend of mine was debating me on this point, saying that, well, spiritual awakening has nothing to do with behavior. You can be a jerk and be enlightened. You're just going to be an enlightened jerk. And I beg to differ. I think that there's a correlation. It may be a loose correlation, like a big stretchy rubber band. It's not like if you're awake to the self, you're just going to be a saint, like that. But I think that it has an influence. And in fact, Adya was saying, even over the past couple of years, he feels like he can feel changes taking place in his brain and his sort of way of functioning. So it's kind of like when the self is realized, it starts working on the vehicle in which it has been realized, and keeps refining that vehicle. If you want to think of it in more sort of spiritual or godly terms, the pure consciousness or pure true nature or self-realization, as it's often described, usually doesn't have much of a divine connotation. It more sounds like a plain vanilla kind of awareness that you realize, and but there's no mention or suggestion of the vast intelligence that is permeating all of creation, and I'm very comfortable with using the word God, although it's a very misunderstood word, and it's kind of hard to use because people have so many connotations and perhaps even traumatic associations with it from their upbringing. But if we define it as the intelligence which so obviously permeates and orchestrates every iota of creation. Boy, I've got several thoughts here I want to develop. Let me illustrate that just for a minute, and hopefully I'll come around and wrap up all these points. There are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches in the world. And there are more atoms in a single grain of sand than there are stars in the universe. And each one of those atoms is a perfectly functioning little thing that we still don't understand. And it's obviously hasn't come into existence through some kind of random billiard ball effect of, there's intelligence, to my understanding and others. There's intelligence. There are intelligent laws of nature, orderly laws of nature, orchestrating it, and orchestrating it in coordination with all the other trillions of atoms in that grain of sand. And that's just a grain of sand. Go out from there, bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, out to the whole universe. You can't find any spot in the entire universe, any cubic centimeter, which, if you analyzed it closely, you would not see some sort of amazing phenomena that defy our understanding and that illustrate or that display vast intelligence. You could take a cubic centimeter way out in the middle of empty space someplace, and even there are gamma rays going through and light, photons and so on, and all kinds of laws of nature. So, to me, with that kind of thinking, it seems that God is hiding in plain sight. And that I talked in the beginning about science helping spirituality. I think science has given us a much clearer and deeper understanding of just how marvelous the creation is and just how amazing God is. There's a beautiful quote from Carl Sagan where he says that, for some reason, hardly any spiritual tradition has looked at the findings of modern science and said, wow, the universe is even more marvelous than we thought, more sublime, more subtle, more beautiful. Instead, most people usually say, oh, no, our God is a little God, and we want him to stay that way, and we reject these findings of science and so on. But to my view, science has, and that's why this whole science and spirituality thing fascinates me, it has kind of opened a window into the divine, which hundreds and thousands of years ago we didn't really have accessible. It's given us a deeper appreciation, or the potential for one, of just how profound the intelligence governing things actually is. All right, now, if that divine intelligence permeates all of creation as I've just described, then it obviously permeates us too. Someone once said, God may be omnipotent, but the one thing he can't do is remove himself from your heart. And if he permeates us, and if he permeates everything, and I say he, excuse me for saying that, you know what I mean, then there really is nowhere that God cannot be found. And again, by God, I mean this all-pervading intelligence that we see evidence of if we look closely enough, but which we kind of take for granted and walk through our days not realizing what a miracle it is that we're actually participating in. There is no place where that intelligence cannot be found. Look anywhere, look closely enough, there it is. So if that is the case, then there really is nothing other than that. If there seems to be something that's other than that, look closely, and oh, sure enough, there it is also. Now, someone might say, oh, I mean, did that really pervade Auschwitz, or does it pervade a pile of dog poop, or something that's really not so enjoyable? But yeah, if you look closely, at least, I mean, look in the cell in the skin of a guard in Auschwitz or a prisoner, and sure enough, that cell is more complicated than the city of Tokyo, and operating according to principles which we hardly understand. There's a miracle taking place in every iota of creation, if we have the eyes to see it. Now, does that miracle have an agenda? Does that intelligence have a purpose, or is it just sort of like playing dice with the universe and there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it's not necessarily going anywhere. It's just sort of bouncing around, and there's suffering here and happiness there, and so on. I would say that there is a sort of an evolutionary trajectory or force or energy or intent that is part of that intelligence. And if there weren't, then I really don't know that we'd have a universe. And I probably sound like a total fool right now to somebody who has a PhD in physics and has really studied this stuff scientifically. I'm coming at it from the perspective of a high school dropout who eventually kind of got his life together and moved on and devoted his life to spirituality and has thought about this stuff for many years. And I have a tremendous amount to learn and always will. I'm just kind of sharing some perspectives and things that interest and inspire me. I feel like there. Oh, do you have a question? Yes, please. Yeah.
What you were saying, maybe a question. But,
yeah.
It seemed that that science says that the universe is expanding. So if that's the case, it would seem that the intelligence has a kind of expanding trajectory.
Yeah.
So I sort of agree with you, and also it just also occurred to me, not just occurred to me, but what I've thought about is, if the universe were one bit negative, it would immediately cease to exist.
Yeah.
It has to be somewhat positive.
There's a
Just
scientist
logically,
named Robert Lanza who has this thing that he calls biocentrism, and he's written a book about it, which I haven't read yet, but I want to, and I would like to interview him. But basically, he talked at SAND a number of years ago. Basically, the point is, and I think other scientists have made this true, there are a whole lot of variables that if they were just one little weensy-beensy bit off, we wouldn't have a universe. The Big Bang would have fizzled, or any number of other things wouldn't have happened that had to happen in order for life as we know it to have appeared. So now some say that, well, it's like the story of infinite number of monkeys pounding on typewriters coming and eventually coming out with Shakespeare, that there have been enough attempts that there are just sort of an infinite number of potential universes, and somehow we live in one where it just by chance came out right, and so we have it as it is. But again, I keep saying I would say. Who am I to say? It's just my opinion, my hunch, my feeling that that it's not. There's no such thing as randomness, and that as you know, talking about intelligence a few minutes ago, that even random things are permeated with intelligence, and if there are laws of randomness, then the intelligence is responsible. That all permeating intelligence is responsible for those, and that there's a sort of an evolutionary drive that has given rise to the universe, and that creates greater and greater and greater complexity. And you know the whole story of how, you know, originally we just had hydrogen and helium, and then the stars were formed, and eventually stars died and exploded, and heavier elements were created in the process of that. And we're all, you know, Joni Mitchell's song, Woodstock, we're all stardust, 40 billion-year-old carbon or whatever, 14 billion. Our bodies are completely made up of elements formed in exploding stars. I kind of feel that the universe is one great big evolution machine. And by evolution I mean developing the capacity for God, Brahman, the ultimate reality, to become a living reality. Because there's something more in that than there is in just unmanifest state. It's like if you're lying in the bathtub, you've been lying there for a while, the water doesn't feel warm anymore. Slosh around a little bit and it gets more enjoyable. So there's, look at, they use the word lila in Sanskrit, the play of creation. There seems to be something playful or creative, in entertaining even, in the whole marvelous universe that we see. Okay, talking too much. Question?
Well, along the lines of what might be the evolution of the universe, and does God consciousness, all universal intelligence, is it guiding some evolution that we can know? You are an exceptional person in having studied the self-realizations of hundreds of people and spent hours with each of them, which is rather rare, and no one else I know of has ever done that. And it would seem that you might have a very strong sense of how humanity, not just individuals waking up, but how could, as you've spoken to this, about our species could be part of this evolution and waking up as one and none. So with all those three levels integrated in each of us and so forth. What do you see as possibly the trajectory of the awakening of, or the enlightenment of the human species at this very pivotal time in human history?
It's a good question. And again, it's just my opinion, but it's funny because everybody's talking about these questions. Somebody will ask a question, or I'll start to make a point, and I think, I just had a conversation about that the other day. People, this kind of stuff is in the air, you know, people are thinking about these things. I kind of see that there seems to be some sort of epidemic of spiritual awakening taking place, as far as I can tell. And that epidemic is being facilitated by technology, the internet, and so on. I kind of feel like the internet is not just sort of a technological breakthrough. There's a kind of a deeper, more cosmic or divine impetus for its creation as a tool through which awakening can propagate. And it's critical that it do so, because I feel that it's really the antidote to the potentially dire problems that confront us. As I was saying earlier, I think all problems are just expressions of the collective consciousness of society, and collective consciousness means the aggregate of all the individual consciousnesses, if that's a word. And if we have problems on the obvious levels of life, it's because every single individual is contributing some influence, which taken collectively gives us these problems. It's kind of like if you have a forest and you fly over it in a plane and it's all gray and withered and dying. It's because every individual tree is gray and withered and dying. You'll see that if you get down into the forest and you see, well, this tree is dead and this tree is dead. But if you want the forest to be green, then you can't just work on you can't spray paint it or work on some broad overall level which doesn't treat the health of each individual tree. Each tree has to be nourished and made more green by being watered, perhaps by being enabled to draw forth the nourishment that is in the ground that it's rooted in, which it may somehow have lost contact with. So I kind of feel like, and hopefully I'm not deviating from your question, but I feel like there's a kind of a welling up from the most fundamental level of life, an awakening of consciousness. And I don't know whether that's being caused by human beings who are intentionally pursuing that, or whether it's coming from the side of consciousness, from the side of the divine, waking up from its slumber. And as it does so, people are just sort of beginning to awake from their slumber. I get contacted by people all the time who, just somehow begin to pop, and they had no interest in spirituality, or they hadn't done any practices or anything else, but they start to have experiences and get into, and they start to have kundalini things going on and whatnot, and they don't know what it is, and so there does seem to be this epidemic of awakening, and I think it's nature's intelligence trying to reset the imbalance that has become kind of so dire, and the pendulum has swung about as far as it can swing without really catastrophic consequences. So it's time for it to swing back, and so that wraps up the point. I shouldn't keep talking. Yes.
In response to his question, thank you. Would you say that it is swinging back? That's the conclusion of that.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's my feeling. And it may be that as it swings back, polarities will appear to be increasing. There'll be greater contention in political races. There'll be greater violence here and there. But I think that maybe that's kind of like possibly a purificatory mechanism, that things have to come to the surface in order to, if there's a blood impurity or something, it has to come out as a boil and be lanced or popped or something, and then the blood impurity can be eliminated. There's a lot of stuff and also just in terms of greater truth, more revelation. There's a lot of stuff that's been hidden in the dark that's kind of coming to light more and more transparency. Yeah. So I really think that the more fundamental level on which you can operate, the more powerful it is. The molecular level is more powerful than the mechanical. The atomic level is more powerful than the molecular. And consciousness is sort of the most fundamental level of all. And if consciousness is being enlivened, if we can operate from that level, and if we can help to participate in the enlivenment of consciousness, then we've got a real pivotal position where we can really affect change, doing less and accomplishing more. It may seem kind of like hopeless at times that there are all these powerful corporations and political entities and so on, and what can little old us do about them? And you can't even seem to vote any kind of change to happen because the political system seems corrupt and so on. But I don't know. I kind of, maybe I'm naive, but I kind of feel like this upwelling of consciousness that seems to be taking place in society, it'll be a David and Goliath kind of situation where the power structures won't be able to kind of survive the phase transition as a more enlightened awareness dawns in humanity. If the power structures are corrupt and don't deserve to survive, maybe some of them aren't and should survive. Yes, Anand.
Ask this pendulum that kind of gets up and then it's so out of whack that it has. I mean, if we think there's an intelligence that it has no randomness and no accidents, so even that has meaning.
Cycles are natural.
Yeah, so it's like maybe that's what's driving evolution. Things have to get a little out of whack to push to the next level. I'm just
It could be.
wondering.
I mean, it does seem that in all phases of life, cycles are natural. There's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Lord Krishna says, when Dharma is in decay and a-dharma flourishes, I take birth, which is not to say that Lord Krishna is going to show up anytime soon, but I think if we think of that as the divine intelligence welling up again in order to reestablish a balance once the imbalance has reached its sort of extreme possibility. I think that's the principle that was being stated there. Michael, if you have any thoughts as you sit there, just pipe in. Michael Rodriguez was I invited him to sit next to me tonight and goad me because we had this great discussion in the car coming down today, and I was going through some of these points, and he kept coming in with all these really great questions and points that made me think of things I hadn't thought of and elaborate a lot more. And so I said, you got to come on stage with me and just do that tonight. But he got hung up somehow and didn't get here till a little while ago. But feel free to pipe up if anything occurs to you. Yeah.
So one Dharma teacher said that life and God are one and the same. Would you go along with that?
That what? Life and what?
Life and God are one and the same?
Yeah, I would say that. Again, it doesn't matter what I say, but in my opinion.
Well, that's helpful to know. You seem like you're pretty
I'm no
sharp.
kind of authority on anything, but in my way of seeing things, God is life and vice versa, and there is nothing but God ultimately. But you have to be careful when you say that not to fall into the trap of that levels thing that I was talking about, where But still, if you think about it, if you think about what we're actually interacting with and what we actually are, but if you look closely enough, if you boil it down to its essence, there's nothing but sort of this vast intelligence orchestrating every minuscule bit of creation.
Okay, and how about, well, this was Adi Ashanti. He said that.
Did he say that?
No, he didn't say that. But this guy said I was too chicken shit to go to India.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was afraid to get hepatitis or amoebic dysentery and all that stuff. And he said that God has never made a mistake in the so-called past. He's never made a mistake in the present, and he's never made a mistake in the so-called future.
Yeah. And therefore, you go to India, and if you get hepatitis, it's not a mistake. Is that the?
No, he just said, don't worry about it. If you're all upset that you didn't go to India, God has never made a mistake. He probably didn't send him to India because he realized things were going to get you're going to get jacked up there or something. You know what I mean?
Well, God helps those who help themselves, and that's kind of that's that three levels thing. On a certain level, everything is divine. You can go to India and get leprosy, and it's all perfect. But it's not perfect on the level of the obvious mundane level of your life.
But how about just the mistakes, though? Just There's
I
no
don't think there are
mistakes?
any mistakes. I don't think it's possible. Well, again, it's a levels thing. There's a certain level on which there are no mistakes.
Right.
And nothing, because everything is divine and perfect just as it is. On an obvious level, you can make mistakes, and if you take recourse, I've seen examples of people who use as an alibi the notion that everything is perfect just as it is,
Right.
to excuse egregious behavior. There's no mistakes. I'm being a jerk, I know, but hey, it's not me doing it. It's just. So you just have to keep doing this thing where you don't land on any fixed position of it's only this or it's only that or it's only that. It's a mistake. It's not a mistake. Nothing ever happened. All three.
To echo back to what we were talking about, that as I understand it, 600 million years ago, our life was largely single cells, and there was the Cambrian explosion, and here we are, multicellular organisms, because as my friend Bruce Lipton says, the only way that cells could get any larger was to collaborate and come together as a multicellular. So now we each have about 50 trillion human cells and about 9 times as many bacterial cells. So there's obviously been a lot of collaboration, and maybe that's what's going to happen with 7+ billion humans, that we're cells that the Earth and the universe created. And so what is it that cells realized and accomplished that we're learning to accomplish? And I really want to
strength in numbers or something.
I want to draw on your knowledge that was so unique of learning from 300 people who have all awoken to this state of grace from many different pathways and different, each in their own unique way. And so you've availed yourself of that and gone out and made this incredible record of Buddha at the Glass Pump from your passion and creativity and service. So how do you feel that we can actually share a transpersonal, collective, already unified intelligence as a species? What does that look like?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't know if I can do justice to the answer, but I can take a shot at it, and I'm sure there could be wiser answers. But I do think that there's... it's like it's natural for life to be diverse, and we wouldn't want to eliminate diversity. And it almost seems like the more verdant and alive something is, like the rainforest, the more diverse it is, So diversity is good. But without a kind of an underlying unity to stitch it together, diversity is fragmented and at odds with itself very often. So I think that as the underlying unity wells up more and more, it won't make us sort of a monolithic culture worldwide where we'll all eat the same thing and believe the same thing and dress the same way. I think it may even, result in a re-enlivenment or re-emergence of ancient and traditional cultures, which really had a lot of wisdom and a lot to offer, but which have been kind of, suppressed or wiped out by, the modern culture. So I don't know if it's going to result in sort of like a merging of countries where we would eventually have sort of one world without separate countries. I don't know. But whether or not it does anything like that, I do think that there would be greater and greater harmony. The more that the more the unified value of life pervades the individual expressions of life, the more harmonized they will be with one another. Just like in our own body, if there weren't some kind of organizing intelligence which coordinated all the biomes, and all of our individual cells and organs and everything else, we wouldn't be able to function. Everything has to function in coordination with one another. And yet a brain cell is not a liver cell and is not a skin cell and so on. We need the diversity in order to be a functioning unit. So I think that, well, I guess I kind of answered it. I don't know if I need to elaborate anymore. The diversity should be, if you take like, a garden. I interviewed David Spangler recently, who was one of the original directors of Findhorn, and that interview will be going up in a couple of days when I get home. But Findhorn was this interesting place in Scotland where it was way up on the North Sea or something, a very inhospitable place near an air base, and it was established in a trailer park, and one half of the trailer park was occupied by people who worked at the air base, and the other half was this Findhorn community that started to develop. And the contrast was stark. The airbase place was just all this sandy, scrabbly soil and nothing much growing or anything else. The Findhorn was like this little Garden of Eden with all this lush plants, and people even tested. There was one guy who was skeptical of it all and brought some roses that he knew couldn't survive in that environment, and gave them to rose plants and gave them to the people at Findhorn. He came back a year later and these roses were thriving, and that made a believer out of him. And the reason the whole thing worked is that it was founded by people who were in tune with all the subtle intelligences of nature, the devas and the fairies and so on that helped to rule the plant kingdom, and they worked in collaboration with those entities and made this really beautiful, lush thing in a very inhospitable place. So, that could be a little bit of an example for what the world might become if we were more deeply attuned to nature's intelligence. And when I say nature's intelligence, I don't mean just the sort of universal intelligence that we kind of sense underlies everything, and we also see it, pervading things. If we look at this glass on a microscopic level, we see all this sort of intelligent structure, things happening. But there are agencies, and Kristen Kirk will be speaking. Well, she's going to be up in San Rafael, but she has experiences like this all the time of these sort of subtler beings and subtler entities which are responsible for, which have roles to play, functions to play in the governance of the universe. Human beings can come to appreciate that and work in collaboration with that. So I guess I'm saying here that in my estimation, an enlightened society would be one in which we're actually not only harmonized with each other as human beings and with the animals and the plants and everything else that we ordinarily see in this world, but that the world is teeming with life beneath the surface, so to speak. If we regard the surface as the gross level of ordinary perception, there are subtle realms, subtler and subtler and subtler realms, and there are more beings living in those subtler realms than there are in the gross level of the world. And some people are aware of them, some quite routinely. I have friends who just, if they were in this room right now, they would see angels and devas and so on. And these are very normal people. They're not like woo-woo cookie folks. It's just their normal everyday reality. That stuff exists, and it very much concerns and influences our human existence. But most of us are oblivious to it. I kind of see an enlightened society as one in which we have joined that subtler brotherhood in a collaborative way, and with tremendous benefit to all of us. They must be sort of shuddering and cringing all the time with the things that we do, to nature and so on. And if we were living in harmony and cooperation with them, we could really have like a global Findhorn situation. Yeah. Hey, somebody new asking a question. Give her the mic.
I want to speak to the question that you just asked about
Sure.
the cells and how cells can form to create greater, more complex organisms, and what are we missing, right, as humans to get that, and the diversity. And I thought of cells aren't biased. Molecules don't have thought. thoughts about what they should join with or they should not, and that we have all these ideas and concepts about what is better to join with and what is worse, such as, well, science tears us apart, right? Our science denotes our spirituality, so therefore, some aversion to the scientific institutions, or like you're mentioning, corporations, business, politics. We feel, oh, what can little old me do? They are terrible. They're destroying our environment. They're bad. And as spiritual folk, we tend to be more attuned to the subtle realms. You know, we ought to be more attuned to the spirits and those that we can't necessarily see with our eyes. But I feel like it's also important to embrace, without bias, the bureaucracy and the corporations. And I have a group that I'm close to that is Buddhist, and there is an infiltration happening of big corporations.
Yeah.
And so for example, I have a friend who worked her way up the ranks on Facebook and started a Facebook compassion program, is planting seeds of goodness in Facebook. So they do a suicide watch, and if people are flagged for being at suicide risk, especially teenagers on Facebook, from things they post, Facebook now runs feeds that have been shown to improve psychological states. So planting seeds of goodness in places we might initially find adversity. So more than just the spirits, we have to embrace the corporations. We have to embrace the politics and see what we can do there to join without bias.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to just sort of happen miraculously that the corporation is going to wake up one day and say, oh, let's change our ways. You know, people are going to have to sort of be in those corporations who would have such, you know, intentions. Anybody ever go to the Bioneers conference? Yeah. I mean, that's such a cool thing. And at the end of the conference, or at a certain stage, they have this big, long list that scrolls down the screen of all these amazing organizations in the world that are doing all these amazing things that, you know, we've never heard of. But there's really a lot of cool stuff happening in the world. And you know, so I guess it's a great point you're making. It's not like, you know, we're just going to have more and more people sitting around in the lotus posture experiencing samadhi and everything's going to change. I think that, you know, all kinds of organizations and efforts and individuals within existing organizations are going to just be getting more and more active and, you know, helping to change things. Yeah. Kristen?
This sort of just came up to share when you initially asked your question. It's stirring things.
This is Kristen Kirk, by the way. She'll be speaking up in San Rafael on tomorrow night.
Yeah. I just wanted to just simply say, in terms of that waking up and recognizing that you're not separate from anything else, then you care about everything on the outside the way you care about everything on the inside, so that in terms of that movement of an awake world, right, all of these things would be happening because there wouldn't be separation from you in a corporation. There wouldn't be separation from you in the health of the water. There wouldn't be separation from anything. And so that you know, I had never thought about, well, what if we all rest in that, your question, because that's also where the power is, because we are all that truth. And to rest in the power of that openness and wonder and creativity and positivity feels like it totally helps support that come into fruition.
So in other words, if you're really genuinely feeling one with everything, then, you know, whatsoever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, as Jesus said. You feel, you know, if the environment is being decimated in some way, or animals are being mistreated, or anything is happening, it's happening to you. It's not just happening to something that's separate from you.
Exactly, and you feel it that way, and you recognize it that way.
Right, you feel it.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you having me here, and it's been a joy to talk to you. I feel like I've kind of, over the course of the evening, sometimes gotten pretty clear, sometimes had a hard time really articulating what I was trying to say, and sort of zooming in and out as I went along. But, you know, I'm a work in progress, and my thinking about all these things is definitely a work in progress, which I'll continue the rest of my life, undoubtedly. But I just love exploring all these sorts of thoughts and ideas and trying to get more and more clear about them, and you know, and not only in terms of individual evolution and enlightenment, but in terms of the planetary implications, because I think that's really important, and I think there are definitely implications. It's not just sometimes people accuse spiritual people of just being self-indulgent or narcissistic or something like that. It's all about me, me, me. But I think that a true spirituality is as relevant to the world as it is to the individual who is, exploring it. And I think we're all in a position to really have an influence, and so we really want to maximize that and make hay while the sun shines. Oh, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.